There are features that allow you to clone domain controllers. If you want to build a domain controller, meaning kind of more of a template domain controller to use and to clone, what you want to do is you want to create a file called Clone Config Xml. Obviously, I'm saying that, and you get a little bit of homework. So this basically is an answer file in XML format that answers how a domain controller should be configured. You then take that file and you store it in the Active Directory database location. By default, that's in C Windows NTDS. It may be somewhere else on your server. That's something that you're going to want to find out. You then want to take your virtual domain controller offline, shut it down. From there, you can export it. And then, once you export it, you can create a new virtual machine by importing that virtual domain controller. And what it will do is it will promote it, but to a unique domain controller within your network. When you're using this cloning feature, and you've got the use of this particular file, and it has to be in the right place or it won't find it, those domain controllers already run their own version of sysprep based on the features in the default dclone allow list.xml file, and that is what brings you a nice fresh copy. Windows Server has a phenomenal new feature, and that is to clone a domain controller. Now, this just came out with Windows Server 2012, and it does imply that your server is virtualized on a Hyper-V platform. In this demonstration, what we're going to do is we're going to show you some of the steps that need to be taken in order for you to get a domain controller ready to be cloned. We're going to start off here in Server Manager. I'm currently on a server that I've called, of course, witty DC clone, so that we know it's the server that I'm going to use to clone out for another server. And I will click on local server just so that you can see the name of the server that we're working on. It is part of the domain for sandraclassroom.local, and based on that, we have all the network settings set up perfectly. Again, it's just a functioning domain controller in this environment. Now, behind the scenes, what I've done with this domain controller is literally installed it fresh. I have no other applications on it. I didn't choose any extra options upon the install, so it's a Windows Server 2012 with Active Directory installed on it. Now, throughout this process, we'll get a chance to see if there's any applications or services that do not clone well, and there are a lot of core Windows services that do not clone well. But I intentionally didn't work through those because I wanted to have you see what it looked like in a pretty fresh install, pure environment. So we need to start off, of course, with making sure that this domain controller has the appropriate rights to be cloned. We do that by adding it to the Clonable Domain Controllers group. So I'm going here into Active Directory Users and Computers. I could do this in PowerShell. I could use the Active Directory Administration Center. Really, any of the Active Directory tools that you're familiar with that allow you to add a computer into a group. Because DC Clone is a domain controller, you'll see it in the Domain Controllers OU. I will right-click on it. I will simply add it to a group, and the name of the group is called Clonable Domain Controllers. So I'll check the names. You'll see it comes right up, and I'll click on OK. Believe it or not, we're almost halfway there. Now, when I say almost halfway there, we now need to generate an XML file, and with that XML file, specify different criteria like what the IP address is going to be, what the name is going to be. But sometimes in generating it, you're going to get some errors in prerequisite check, so it forces you to fix things before we get to that point. But the basic steps are, put it in the group, generate the XML, shut it down and export it out of Hyper-V, and then you import it on the other side. So cloning a domain controller, as long as the domain controller is fine, is actually a pretty easy process now. So we have it in the right group. Understand this group has a very default set of rights and permissions, so don't ever modify the group in its rights and permissions. So whether through group policy or local security policies, wherever you go, if you see an entry for it, make sure that it is left behind. Our next step is to create this file called DC Clone Config .xml. The one big difference between a cloned domain controller and a domain controller that's being imported or restored is this particular file. This is what makes it different. Now, DC Clone Config .xml has all the settings to be cloned when it boots, and of course all the settings are going to be different. These are your network settings, DNS, WINS, Active Directory site name, new domain controller name, anything that you know has to be changed the first time this domain controller boots up. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off PowerShell. We're all done here, and we need to run PowerShell in an administrator context. Now I am going to click on Tools, and you will see the Active Directory module for Windows PowerShell right there in the list. I just wanted to point that out, and I believe, yep, here we go. I believe I have it already in the background because I was working with PowerShell earlier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the new AD clone config commandlet in PowerShell. And I will warn you, if this doesn't work for you the first time, that's normal. And the other piece is, I tend to type this wrong more times than right. I think there are too many D's, too many C's in there, whatever it is, just trying to get the command right. I always have to pause and make sure I've spelt everything right. So, new AD DC clone config, and then of course the magic word file. So as I execute it, notice it's running in local mode. It tells you that it's finding the PDC FSMO role. It's going to verify authorization, checking that the domain controller is a member of the clonable domain controllers group. And it's located in the local domain controller, DC clone centerclassroom.local. That's passed. It's validating the cloning allow list. Notice there are no excluded applications that are detected. And from there, all preliminary validation checks passed, and we're brought back here. So we now have, under the root of C, in Windows NTDS DC clone config.xml. Now I am here to tell you that one of the reasons this came up so perfect clear without any error is because it was a fresh install with not a single other role on there. Not only that, I hadn't run too many Windows updates where certain things like .NET Framework get passed down. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to continue and just show you how to clone this domain controller, but I'm going to run the same exact command on a different domain controller just so that you can see what the difference is and how you might actually go ahead and fix that. So for right now, I will leave PowerShell up and running. I'm going to move into Windows Explorer, and let's go take a look at what this file looks like. So you'll see DC clone config. Let me open this up. Apparently Internet Explorer 10 wants something to do with the process. And all I want to show you here is XML version 1.0, DC3, DC clone config, and you'll see we have a very simple schema line right here. Now, what happens if I take DC clone config and I delete it? Remember, we're going to go round and round a couple of times. I'm going to show how to create this again, but when we create it again, I'm going to put some arguments in there. So let's minimize. We have PowerShell back up and running. I will clear the screen. And I do want to bring that command back, but instead of just saying new ADDC clone config file, I want to add some parameters so that you can see this file get populated. And I show this for a couple of reasons. For one, you need to understand how to put in the parameters, but for two, I know when I first started working with this utility, it wasn't always obvious that we couldn't just create a file, but that we had to add everything else. So let's look at what some of the differences are. So we're going to say -IPv4 address, and then of course we have to give it an address. Yes, this means you actually have to have a little bit of planning. We have to tell it the gateway. So IPv4 default gateway. We have to give it a subnet mask. And a DNS address. Remember, Active Directory does not survive without DNS. So if it can't resolve DNS, you're in for a world of hurt. So IPv4 DNS resolver. Make sure everything is static. And then we can even give it a site name. And I'm just going to put this in the default first site. So again, it's going to run in local mode. It's going to pass the same test that it went through last time. And of course, it's going to create that file. There's our DC clone config. Now, instead of opening it up with Internet Explorer, that was just an open in view. There was nothing I could modify. I'm going to right-click and hit Edit. You'll get a chance to see it in Notepad. So the first DC clone config file had only those lines, and of course, ending the code as well. But now you're going to see that we have all of this extra information that was populated from the default first site to the IP settings, the address, the subnet mask, the gateway, the DNS server. So now if I was to clone this domain controller, it's going to be right in here. Now you can also write your XML files, and you can write them right here in Notepad if you understand the language. So if you know how to put in what the host name of this is going to be or any of the other information, you can certainly do so just by using Notepad and editing the file. We're not going to do that here. I am going to, however, show you how to get a little bit of help. So I will clear the screen, and we're going to run get help new ADDC clone config file. Do I wish to update help? Not right now. It's got what I need in there, I'm sure. Okay, so I'm just going to move up. Again, I don't want to drag this on too far, but we've already seen the new ADDC clone config file with the IP4 address and the site name. But just to show you that there's a lot of parameters, and they work the same way. You just continue to do dash alternate Win server, then the Win server, dash clone computer name, and then what the name is going to be. So it is the exact same syntax you saw me write. You just have to pick and choose here what you personally want in that file. So dash clone computer name, it needs a string. Is it going to be required? Position, accept pipeline. So it gives you everything you need. Here's your IP address and all the resolver information. So if you just really think about everything that you would want to change from one domain controller to the other, you will find that you have it right here in help so that you understand all the parameters and how they're spelled. So again, not going to beat this up any longer. I always like to make sure people know where to find the answers, like how do I do this, how do I do that. Type it in if you know the attributes, or go right up here and say get-help on the new ADDC clone config file. If you do -full, you'll get all the parameters you can use, and you can kind of work it out from there. Now what I would like to do is I would like to run this on a machine that isn't going to work. Now of course this is going to be the Murphy's Law where I say it's not going to work and it's suddenly going to work. But I know that I have a machine that came up with a bunch of applications, and I just want to make sure you know how to handle that. So in order to do that, I do have to switch machines. So here I am at DC1. It is a different domain controller. I'm going to go in here to Active Directory Users and Computers, and let's check the membership. So if you go to Member Of, you're going to see that it is in fact in Clonable Domain Controllers. This is actually the first domain controller in my lab environment that I tried to clone. I will show you that we seem to have a lot of roles listed down here, which does imply that we might be running certificate services or file and storage services, maybe an iSCSI server. So without even going in there, I'm just immediately going to go right into Tools, right into the module for PowerShell. And here within the module for PowerShell, might have been a great idea to do this for you a little bit earlier, but let's increase the font a little bit because I want you to be able to see what the errors are. And when I say error, let's call them information sources. So now what I'm going to do is simply new addc clone config file. It's got the FSMO role, it's a member of the clonable domain controllers, and then suddenly validation failed. Please run the get addc clone excluded application list commandlet and evaluate the listed applications for cloning. The clone configuration file will not be generated. So it didn't generate one. It's telling us that there's applications or services on this domain controller that do not clone well. These could be the Windows services, which in generally they are correct, they don't clone well, or it could be a third-party application. So let's run it and see what it says. So what this means is in order to clone this domain controller, you would have to take off the Windows Azure Backup Agent, Visual C++, App Host Service, Certificate Services, Cluster Services, the OB Engine, SMB Witness, W3 Service, that's your World Wide Web, otherwise known as IIS, WAS, and WinTarget. All of those services have to be disabled or at least tested for clonability. Now, once you've gone through and you've tested, let's say this is a third-party application and you've called the vendor, you've tested it out, it does in fact clone perfectly, you can actually add that to a file. And this particular file, the clone config file, will know to actually ignore these particular applications. But if you right now know they're going to work and you just have to edit the file in order to do so, all you have to do is run that same utility or commandlet, and we're going to go ahead and put in generate XML. So notice here, the inclusion list was written to C Windows NTDS custom clone allow list.xml. So that list has now been modified so that it will clone it regardless of those applications being on there. Now again, I'm not telling you to go ahead and leave any application without testing, but if you have tested it, then you can essentially override it by writing it to this particular file. So it does go ahead and go into Windows NTDS custom DC clone allow list. Why not go ahead and take a look at that? And you'll see that it's all right here, the name of the service, the name, the type, and all of those applications that we will allow to be cloned. So there you have it. We have an ability to make a clone config file, to make an allowed cloned application file, how to look it up, where the data gets written to. From here, we should be able to go ahead and run our brand new switch to say, give me a clone config file that will work very nicely with this. So let's clear the screen. Just so you can focus on what I'm working on, we are going to go into the new -addc clone config file. And notice here it is successfully generated. There are no excluded applications that were in fact detected. So again, that custom DC clone allow list is what basically gave them permission to be cloned. So now we have that XML file that we're looking for. For the record, by the way, there is a template of the DC clone allow list XML file, and it is in the file system. But essentially, we never want to touch that. We always want to make sure that we run these commands to create a new version of it and never touch the original versions. So from here, we've done all the hard work, and it really hasn't been too hard. We put it in the clonable domain controllers. We did the custom clone allow list. Now, again, I did not take the time to disable all those applications in this case, so we're probably going to go back to the other server. But we should be able to literally shut this domain controller down and export it out of Hyper-V, and now we've got a clone domain controller to work with. So let's go back to the other one. I don't want to clone this one because, again, it is the one with all of the services that do not clone well. And let's move back to the DC clone. So here we are on DC clone. The very last step is to export it out. This can be done either through PowerShell or just by using the Hyper-V console. However, regardless of which way you want to run an export, the command is not available to you unless you physically have shut it down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut down. And then we'll move to the Hyper-V console and show you how to export it. So you'll see DC1 is still up and running. That's our primary domain controller, not in a PDC fashion for those of you who know that term, but just saying that that is the login server that I have left. And we're going to take DC clone, right-click, export it. Let's browse for a location. I'm going to put it right here in that clone folder and hit export. And I'm just going to move to the right to show you that it is fully exporting, and we'll take a look at the file structure in a little bit. So you'll see here that it was successfully exported. So let's go ahead and take a look at the exported file structure. And you're going to see right there we have our clone folder. There's our DC clone, snapshots, virtual hard drives, virtual machines. So it really has exported the full structure out. So from here, that file structure can, of course, be re-imported here if it's going to be on the same Hyper-V server. Most of the time, we export them out to import somewhere else. So you take that file structure over to somewhere else, and when you import it, best to do within PowerShell. So of course you just use the import-vm, and you have to of course give it a path to that clone directory. But there's also, if you know about importing virtual machines, you can either import as is or you can take a copy of it. So you will want to make sure that you import it in, and you do a -copy, so that happens, and then a -generate new ID, and of course the destination path of where that's going from.